And so again, what underpins the trade-off theory is this idea that debt, let me go back here, debt initially is good because of tax reasons and because of other reasons that we will discuss in video 8. There are other good things that debt does for you. It's not just taxes, by the way. We'll say more about that later. But eventually, for sure, debt is going to start causing problems. And it's going to start causing problems because the more debt you have, the most likely that you're going to get into payment difficulties, that you're going to get into a region where default and bankruptcy become positive probability events. And default and bankruptcy are bad. And they are bad for a number of reasons. One is the obvious, that you have to call in lawyers, and calling in lawyers always destroys a lot of value. And you're going to have to go in front of a judge, reorganize assets. All of that is going to kill a lot of value. So there is that. But what I want to discuss today is that there are also other more subtle reasons why bankruptcy is bad. And the basic story here is going to be that once a corporation has a positive probability of going into bankruptcy, managers and shareholders are going to enter into behavior that may be detrimental to value creation. By which I mean, very simply, that they're going to have a tendency to pass on positive NPV projects, and they are going to, even worse perhaps, have a tendency to take on some negative NPV projects under some circumstances. And we want to discuss those circumstances here. So let us first talk about one of the big reasons why the possibility of bankruptcy may lead managers, shareholders, or the managers representing them to pass on positive NPV projects. The problem is when default is a positive probability event, it means that debt holders may not be paid in full. And so then if there are states of the world in which in the future debt holders are not going to be paid in full, that means that those debt holders are going to go after every asset they can to be made whole. And that, of course, is going to include any new projects that I may take on at this point. So that means that when bankruptcy is a positive probability event, when I take on a new project, unfortunately, there is a probability that some payoff of that new project is going to go to the debt holders because they have priority. So if I want to say finance a project entirely with equity, and that turns out to be as a standalone project, a positive NPV project, it may be that once I take into account that I'm going to get taxed by those debt holders that have yet to be paid, and they're going to come after the payoff of this new project, well, it may no longer be a positive NPV project for me, the equity holders, even though clearly for the corporation, it would be a positive NPV project. Okay, so this is a story that was told first. I mean, he did not invent it, but he formalized it certainly in 1977 by Myers. So that's the debt. This is a story we call the debt overhang story. And I want to get today into some details as to how debt overhang works. And as usual, we're going to do this by considering a simple example. And here I'm going to take the simplest possible example I can think of a corporation that is on the brink of bankruptcy, a corporation for which bankruptcy is a positive probability event. So to make this as simple as possible, I'm going to assume that the corporation is going to live for exactly one more period. And in that final period, next period, they're going to make $80 million. Those are the last cash flows they're going to make with probability 50%. Or they're going to make $100 million with probability 50%. And in addition, this corporation, which has just one more period to live, they owe money to debt holders. And specifically, they owe $90 million to debt holders in this final period. So this means that bankruptcy or default is, as is for this corporation, a positive probability event. If it turns out that my final cash flows are $80 million, I'm going to fall short of the $19 million. And that's exactly what is going to cause the problem. My debt holders, if somehow, some way, right now, I'm able to bring more assets into the corporation, they're going to say any payoff on those assets are first going to come to me in this state of the world. Why? Because I am owed $10 million that you were not able to pay me. So let's imagine that in fact a new investment opportunity becomes available to the corporation today. And we're going to make a big assumption, which is that this new project has to be financed with equity. When you are looking at a corporation that is this close to bankruptcy, that makes sense. This is not a time at which you're going to be able to raise debt. So if you're going to take on more investments as you are one period away from a period in which there's a 50% chance in which you're going to go bankrupt, it's going to be hard to get any debt. So, but for now, we're just going to make the hard assumption that the new project has to be financed with equity. We're going to assume that the project costs $10 million to implement right now, and it's going to generate some number that we're going to calculate in a moment. But for now, we're just leaving it be as an unknown, and we're going to call it X. If this were a standalone project, in other words, if those equity investors were taking on this project outside this corporation, untied to this corporation, what they would require by way of return from this project is 5%. Now, here, this is actually a risk-free project, the way we wrote it. I invest 10 and I get X back. If I need a 5% return, that means that all I need is that X be 10.5 million. If X is 10.5 million, if this was a standalone project, this would be a project whose NPV is equal to 0. So anything above 10.5 million and I would be good to go. But the problem is that the project cannot be separated from the corporation. This is an investment option that belongs to the corporation. And part of the corporation are those debt holders that are owed $90 million. So, given this situation, we can ask, how high must X be to justify investing into the new project? And we're going to make the conservative assumption that equity investors continue to require 5%, even though now the project cannot be separated from the corporation, and therefore they're going to take on some risk, namely the risk that they're going to be taxed by those debt holders that we may not be able to pay next period. So this is a conservative assumption, and we're going to say that even if they don't start asking a risk premium, given that they have to make that investment inside a corporation that is on the brink of bankruptcy, even then the X that they're going to need to make this work is going to be much higher than the X that you would need if this were a standalone project. And the upshot, therefore, is going to be that this is a corporation that is going to pass on clearly positive NPV projects that as standalone projects would be positive NPV project. Okay, so that's the question. The question is, how high must X be to justify investing in the new project? And remember, we know that if this was a standalone project, X simply would have to be 10.5 million. So let's go to Excel to make this work. And I'm going to create a new canvas. And I'm going to make it big enough, and I'm going to start typing all the information that I have in this question. So one piece of information is that when cash flows are high, next period the corporation is going to get 100 million. This is before the new investment. When cash flows are low, instead the corporation is going to get 80 million. I have debt holders that are owed 90 million. The probability of getting the high cash flow is 50%. The probability of getting the low cash flow in the next period is 1 minus that. So far, so good. There is the required rate of return by my equity investor into the new project, and that is 5%. And I repeat that we are making an assumption here that it is 5% no matter what. It's 5% if it's a standalone project. It's 5% even if I have to make this investment inside a corporation that's on the brink of bankruptcy. Again, for our purposes, that's a very conservative assumption. Things would be even worse we would be even more likely to pass on this project if we recognize the fact that this has now become more risky. Okay, 5%. And then, of course, there is this payoff X, which I do not know what it is, but as usual in this class, I get to assume. So I get to start by guessing what the value is going to be. And here, a good guess is 10. Oh, I don't want any percent anymore. So let me format all those cells as numbers with 2 decimals. Good. So a good starting guess is 10.5 million. Why? Because 10.5 million, you can check this, is what I would need to make this work if this were a standalone project. But of course, it is not a standalone project. So that means that the project payoff, if cash flow is high, in principle may not be the same as X itself. So why? Because here's what I'm going to get. So if all goes well, at the most, I'm going to get whatever the project is going to pay. But then I have this debt overhang problem, which is I have those debt holders which may or may not get paid. So when do they get paid? So let's assume that for whatever reason I fall short of the 90 million. So if I fall short of the 90 million, what I would have to pay my debt holders is 90 minus the cash flow that I'm going to get in the next period. So here 90 minus 100. But of course, in this case, what's happening? I have enough money to make my $90 million. So it's all good. It's not like, given that I have enough money, I'm not going to get those extra 10 million from the my debt holder. So the tax that I'm going to get is only if I fall short of what I need. In other words, only if this number is positive. So if it is negative, I'm going to turn it into a 0. So this is an expression that you want to stare at. So this is basically, this is 90 minus the cash flows that I have. If it is positive, that means I'm falling short of what I owe my debt holder and holders, and for sure the new project is going to get taxed, which is what's happening here. But if it is negative, everything is well, and I get to keep everything from the project, in which case it's a 0. And this max operator here is taking care of both possibilities. Let me make sure that this works. Yeah, so that makes sense, right? If the cash flow is high, I get 10.5 from the project. There is $100 million coming from the corporation, which I'm going to be able to use to pay my debt entirely. So no tax. I get to pay. I get to keep everything. But now, what is the project payoff if the cash flow of the corporation is low? So again, in principle, I get all of my X, but there is now the fact that my debt is actually bigger than the cash flow that I am getting, and I'm going to put this max operator again so that it will work no matter what inputs I put in this particular project. And look, in this particular case, all I get to keep is $500,000. Why? Because the project is paying 10.5, but my shareholders are short by 10 and they have priority over me, the equity holders. So they are going to tax this new investment by $10 million. Very good. And so it gives me an expected payoff on new project, which is equal to the probability that I'm going to get the high cash flow times my payoff on the new project in the event that I get high cash flows. And here I'm just realizing that I'm not being very disciplined about my F4. So I'm going to continue being undisciplined, but of course, you know that good practice, not that it matters here, but good practice is to put an F4 on anything coming from your inputs. So you should do it. I did not do it. Anyway, plus P low time the projected payoff if the cash flow is low. So this right here is my expected payoff on the new project. And let me make sure that I've done this right. That doesn't look right at all. What have I done? Ah, See, that doesn't look right because I should be halfway between those two numbers. And if you look at what I've done, of course, you have noticed it on the videos already, but I am slow. So here we go. So that's the expected payoff on the new project. Good. And now let's calculate the NPV of the project to see whether or not at this expected payoff, my investors, my equity investors are willing to take on the project or not. And so my NPV is going to be the expected payoff discounted at my 5% rate of return. So this is the present value of the cash flows associated with the project minus the cost of the project, which I did not make an input. That is not good. So I'm going to insert here a line, insert, shift cell down. This is cost of new project. That's a new input, and that is $10 million. And now I can start again. Expected payoff on the project divided by 1 plus 5%. That's the present value of future cash flows minus the cost of the new project. And obviously, this is a negative NPV project at this point because of the tax that I'm going to get if the corporation goes bankrupt on my assets. So this is the NPV. So that means that I would be willing to take on this project at a payoff of 10.5 if this was a standalone project, but I'm no longer willing to do the same because I know I have this debt overhang problem. Good, so of course it invites the question of what do I need X to be in order for this NPV to be non-negative? And of course we know that X needs to be bigger than 1050, and in fact this is one of our traditional goal-seek question. I want this NPV to be 0 or better, and so what do I need X to be to make that happen? And I'm just going to let it go. And the answer is $15.5 million. Whereas as a standalone project, 10.5 million would be enough to make this work. Because it is part of a corporation that's on the brink of bankruptcy, 15.5 is what I need. And I have not even figured all the transaction costs, those lawyers that I've mentioned associated with bankruptcy. So things would be even worse if there was exogenous destruction of value. The bottom line is once default becomes a positive probability as a result of the debt overhang problem, I'm going to pass on projects that are perfectly good projects that I would take under normal conditions. So the proximity of bankruptcy does in fact destroy value for a corporation for more reasons than one. Okay, good. So this is all I wanted to say about the debt overhang problem. And so there's just one final thing that I want to do for today with the time that I have left on this video, but this is going to be somewhat of a left turn. So we're going to need a brand new Excel file tab. And so here we are. Okay, so what do I want to do with my few minutes left? So I want to revisit the very first problem that we did in this class, which was the question of if I have the option to call or refinance a bond, when is that a positive NPV decision? And we did all the calculations perfectly well in chapter 1. But the one thing we did not do is we did not yet take into account the tax implications of that decisions. And what we've learned in this chapter is that debt has an impact on how much I owe in taxes. And in fact, I mean, we knew this already, but what we learned is how to compute the value of that interest, the present value of that interest tax shield. So if you think about the calculations we did in chapter 1, one of the consequences of lowering your interest payment is you lower the tax shelter that you get from those interest payments. So the calculations we did in chapter 1 did not take into account the fact that there's going to be a loss in interest tax shield. And so this is what I want to do properly here today. And one of the reasons to do this is in your homework number 6, there is a question where this is exactly what I ask you to do. Redo our standard NPV calculations with taking into account the tax implications. So the easiest way to do this is to do this in the context of a specific example. So we are going to look at a bond that has 5 years left to maturity, and for simplicity I'm going to assume that this is going to be a bond with fixed and yearly payment. The current interest rate is going to be 10%. The new interest, so that's the interest that I'm going to get if I refinance, is going to be 8%. The balance on the loan is going to be $100 million, so that's the size of the bond. As usual, there is a refi cost, which is going to be 2% of outstanding principal. So this is this is the standard refi cost that we've used throughout. And now there's one piece of information that we are now doing this for a tax corporation, and then we're going to do this for a corporation whose tax rate is 30%. Okay, very good. But for now, let's just remember how this works. So the way we do our standard refi calculation is we calculate the current payment, we do the new payment, that's going to give me some yearly savings, and those yearly savings are going to give me my NPV of refi, and this is going to be under no taxes for a corporation with no taxes. So these are the calculations that we've done so far. Because I've set fixed and yearly payment, I get to use my payment formula, which is very nice. So the current rate is 10%, F4, the number of periods are 5, F4. These are, remember, yearly payments, so I do not need to divide my interest rate by 12. I need this annoying minus in front of the balance, F4, and it gives me my current payment of $26 million and change. The new payment is going to be essentially the same, except that the rate is now going to be 8%, F4. Oh, what have I done? Let me undo what I did. I wanted to adjust the second one, not the first one. And this is my new interest rate. Very good. So I go from a payment of 26 million to about 25 million, which is a yearly savings of 26 minus 25, which is about 1.33 per year. And so I can calculate the present value at the proper discount rate, which is 8% for 5 periods, F4 of minus my savings, and I get that so this is just for so far the present value of refi, and it says here NPV of refi. So let me finish the work by taking into account the cost of refinancing, which is minus 2%, F4 times the $100 million, F4. Very good. So that's my NPV of refi. But what I just said is we did not take into account the loss of interest tax shield. So let's compute how much I've lost in interest tax shield, given that I went from a high interest rate bond to a low interest rate bond. And for this, because we need to know the exact pattern of interest payment, we have to write let me write this as current bond. And let me write a full-blown debt payment table. So there's going to be 5 years, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There's going to be an initial balance. There's going to be a payment. There's going to be some interest, and there's going to be some final balance. So completely standard calculation. My initial balance is equal to $100 million. F4, my payment I've already calculated on the current bond is this guy. My interest, this is always the same formula, initial balance times interest rate, which is the current interest rate, F4. My final balance, that formula is always initial balance plus interest minus payment. Great. I need to do year 2 like always. My initial balance is going to be the final balance from the previous year. My payment does not change, and those two formulas can be copied down, and then I can click the entire row, and as long as I get a nice 0 down here, everything is well. I'm going to format everything as number with 2 decimals so that it all looks pretty. So this is my current bond. Everything is good. So I need to compare my current bond to the bond that I'm going to get if I refinance. So what is going to change? So the balance is not going to change. The payment is going to change. The payment is going to be equal to 25, as it says here. And of course, my interest formula is going to change. It's going to be multiplied by 8%, F4, not by 10%. And I can click this. And as long as I click this properly, I'm going to get my 0 at the bottom, which is very strong indication that I've done everything right. And so now what I can calculate is every year my loss in interest tax shield. So what's my loss in interest tax shield? Well, I used to pay this in interest, and now I only pay that. This is in year 1. And how much do I lose? Well, I lose 30% of that because this is a deduction that I'm no longer getting. So I'm going to lose 30% of that. So I'm going to lose $600,000 in year 1. I'm going to format this as a number with 2 decimals, and I'm going to click. I can't because it's not contiguous. So I'm going to drag it down, and these are all my loss in interest tax shield. So this is the cash flow that I'm going to lose every year. So everything is good. And now I can calculate my loss in interest tax shield as the present value, which here is going to be an NPV at this discount rate here. So now here, that's an assumption. Is this discount rate the proper discount rate for this guy? So we made the case, we wrote a proof that for yearly savings, for sure, 8% is the proper discount rate. Now, it is typical to discount the interest tax shield at the rate of return on debt. And the reasoning for this is that interests are going to be more or less proportional in general to the debt payment. And therefore, if the market is requiring 8% from debt payments, since it's all proportional, it would make sense that the market would require 8% from interest. But of course here, interest and payment are not proportional because I'm looking at a fixed payment bond. So this is a bond that is going to amortize. This is not an interest only bond. So this 8% here is an assumption. The thing is, we don't know what else to do in practice, to be honest about this. This is as good as it gets, but you cannot write as formal a proof that it is the right discount rate as we did in for the case of monthly savings. Why? Because this particular interest pattern is not one that we see traded as is in the market. Now, the good news is if you are a corporation, most of the time, the bonds that you do issue are coupon bonds. So they are interest only bonds and everything is well. And clearly this is the discount rate that you want to use. But here we are making an assumption, and I just want you to be aware of it. In general, I don't think it's that big a deal of an assumption. In particular, people say, look, if this is debt that is essentially risk-free, so if you're looking at a highly rated corporation, that debt is trading at the risk-free rate. The interest itself is therefore risk-free, and again, therefore it should be discounted at the risk-free rate. Anyway, that can be defended in this fashion. I could discuss this at great length, what I think about those arguments, but we're going to leave it as it is now. Again, it's hard to think of anything better to do anyway. So very good. So we're going to discount all those interest tax shields, and that's going to give me an NPV of $1.66 million. So this is the value of the interest tax shield that I have lost. And so that means that my true NPV of refi with taxes is going to be equal to this amount minus the loss in interest tax shield. And you can see that obviously, depending on whether you are a taxed or non-taxed corporation, sometimes it's going to make sense to refinance and sometimes it's not. So for instance, assuming that the new rate was 9% rather than 8%, I would find if I'm an untaxed corporation that refinancing makes sense, but if I am a tax corporation, I will find that refinancing does not make sense because the loss in interest tax shield means that the after-tax cost of debt is much lower than the before-tax cost of debt. So obviously, it matters. Another thing that I will say, just to repeat, is that most corporations issue interest-only coupon bonds. For those, there is a shortcut, of course. You do not need to calculate the loss of interest tax shield independently. All you have to do is look at the after-tax payment on that because it's all interest. So if you do the present, here what I'm saying is for current payment, you would write the after-tax current payment. For new payment, you would write the after-tax new payment. So in other words, you would multiply this number here by 1 minus 30%, and it would work perfectly well. It would give you exactly the same answer as what we did here, as long as you are looking at a coupon bond. If you are not looking at a coupon bond like here, then you have no choice but to write the exact pattern of interest like we did here. So very good. So at this point, this is the complete story. This is how you do refinancing, taking into account tax implications. And with that, I'm going to stop this video right here.